I'm going to be covering talks about conservation easements, specifically how they can work towards specific goals such as aquifer protection. I represent the Texas Land Conservancy, which is a statewide organization. We have certain regions that are prioritized, and those are a lot of times done around water, and I'm going to get into that methodology today a little bit. But I'm going to first talk about conservation easements in general, in case you don't understand how they work and what they do, and our organization, and then after that, how you can go about finding help from organizations if that seems to be a good tool for your organization or landowners or something like that in Texas. So real quickly, we'll go through the basics. Texas, 97% privately owned. That's a very common statistic that people throw out. They don't often see it visualized. That is all the red stuff that we've got in Texas that's public, compared to our neighbor in New Mexico, where we have much more Forest Service, BLM, and public land. So that means all the private land conservation done in Texas has to be done through one of two entities, either private groups like ours or the Parks and Wildlife Department. Additionally, we're on path right now. We're typically losing about 1.5 million, 1.4 acres per decade, and that's rural conversion of either agriculture or traditional farming, ranching properties into some other purpose, typically housing, commercial development, something that is no longer in that status. From the standpoint of what's actually protected, there's about 20 to 25 organizations like myself scattered throughout the state doing this kind of work. Collectively, we've put together about 1.8 million acres of privately protected habitat across the state, both through conservation easements and through ownership of the land ourselves. That eclipses what is actually held by Texas Parks and Wildlife in both their park systems and their WMAs, which is around 1.6 million acres. So as I said on before, we're on a glide path right now. By 2030, we're another 1.5 million gone. That typically happens along the I-35, I-45 corridor. Not surprising that all the population centers are gobbling up land faster than any other place around right now. As I said before, the two main focuses in this state for land conservation are Texas Parks and Wildlife or private landowners. That's the only ways that it's really getting done. Parks and Wildlife typically brings on maybe a new park every few years, maybe a new WMA. They are not moving the needle fast enough to keep up with the demand for public access. If any of you all have been to a state park recently, you know that they're being loved to death. And so the alternative is working with private landowners to find some other ways to make sure natural resources are protected, and that's typically working with groups like ours. So specifically, what is a conservation easement? There's a lot of misnomers around this, but at its most basic form, it's a legal agreement between a landowner and a qualified entity. That is typically a land trust. So we are a 501c3 organization. They can also be done between a governmental entity, NRCS, Texas Parks and Wildlife, or a municipality. City of San Antonio is a good example with all of their aquifer protection over the recharge zone. The main thing about this is the land is still owned by the landowner. It's still run by the landowner. There is not public access given through a conservation easement. It is only protecting that piece of property with the legal protection of it. So for the lawyers in the room, if you remember your real estate property law, a bundle of sticks is the most common analogy that is referred to of all the rights that go along with a piece of property. You have oil and gas rights, you have hunting rights, you have grazing rights, you also have development rights, and all of those can be separated from property. Just like oil and gas can be taken with you when you leave a piece of property behind and you retain those, the same thing can be done with development rights. So what a conservation easement does is it takes the development portion of those bundle of sticks and moves it to a land trust, just as if you took an oil and gas right and moved it along with a family member or to another entity. All of those other bundles or pieces of that thing stay with the landowner. Doesn't diminish your oil and gas, it doesn't diminish your hunting rights, it doesn't take anything away. It's only taking that one individual property right, the development rights, out of that equation. So specifically for our organization, and this is kind of the heart of where we get into what we do, we were facing an opportunity to say, where could we make the most impact with the work that we did, and how could we do that across the entire state of Texas? So about a decade ago, we embarked on a conservation plan that was basically, we entitled it Land for Water, to look at both threats and opportunities around the state. And when we looked at threats, we said, where's the land developing the fastest? Where are there more opportunities to find those pieces of property that are solely being gobbled up? Where can the different watersheds be most impacted by this? And so we evaluated every county with that metric. Likewise, we said, where are there opportunities? We looked at where there are currently state parks being located, where there's other conserved land through other land trusts. Where do we know that there are springs, there's recharge features, there are those vital cultural aspects that need to be conserved also? And then we overlaid those two things together to basically said, where can we spend the most of our effort and make the most bang for our buck? Because we're like any organization, we have limited resources. So when we came up with this map, what you see on here is basically the black areas, we considered them basically over the cliff, and that was the counties that were right down the edge of I-35, right around the cluster of Houston, that there were so few resources left to conserve in a big chunk that our best opportunity was to move just outside of those rings of bullseyes. Likewise, and we said we look at West Texas, we know there's tremendous opportunity to conserve land there, but there's also not a lot of threat or pressure being put on that. And so that's when we came up with this model to work from. And then we overlaid key watersheds into that so we could say, where do we want to focus that, because water was such a critical nexus for land conservation and water conservation. So our conservation planning efforts stem around 6 major watersheds in Texas. In East Texas, the Neches and the Trinity, the Brazos going through the central part down on the lower part, and then in the hill country, it's the Llano, the Pedernales, and the Medina. And those are specifically chosen because we had the most opportunity based on what we currently worked with, and we knew that there was opportunities to work with landowners there. So when we zoom in, and you look at, for instance, the Trinity watershed, you have an 8 million population of people living in this fairly closed off watershed that supplies water to both Dallas and to Houston. It's made up of 6 million acres, and it provides 40% of Texas's water, so it's a vital resource. What we ended up doing was then taking that watershed and overlaying multiple different aspects of GIS resources through both water, soil types, biodiversity indexes, anything that we could think of that we can put into the mix, and basically came up with a hotspot map for all of these individual watersheds. So what that looks like in real life is something like this, and when you get down to a fine grain level, and you move into an area around, let's say, Richland Chambers or the Richland Creek WMA, we looked at what landowners were around there, what resources could be done to increase the impact of those existing watershed resources, existing public land resources as well. And so through outreach efforts that we're doing individually, that we're talking to those entities, the Parks and Wildlife, and saying, hey, can you help us reach your neighbors? We're sending out flyers. We're saying, hey, would this be something interest to you? We're working through NRCS. We're working through any different opportunity we have to reach landowners and help conserve resources around what we consider the highest and best properties that are still left to conserve in the state. So right now, we manage 167 projects around the state. It's a little less than 125,000 acres. And that's comprised of both conservation easements and properties that we actually own and manage for different purposes around the state. And you can see those watersheds, how they overlay and where we've tried to focus our effort over the time. If this is something of interest, and like I said, we have the equivalent of TAG in the Texas Land Trust Council. Lori Olson, who's sitting somewhere out here in the world, there she is the executive director of that organization and does, like I said, something very similar. And you can find different land trusts that's focus on specific areas. It might be around a certain watershed, it might be around a certain region of the state, it might be statewide, it might be a certain type of thing like agricultural land only, so it just varies. But you can go to their website and find out who is fitting for that, for the best thing for that. And that's what I've got.